Looking for a heartwarming children's book with a powerful message?
Being Me is the Best Thing to Be by Judy Erb tells the story of Honey, a curious little turtle who learns that being herself is the very best thing to be. It's a wonderful read for children, parents, and grandparents celebrating self confidence and self acceptance.
You can purchase this book on BookBaby, Amazon, or Barnes& and Noble.
If you want an autographed copy, you can email Judy directly at jerbauthor@gmail.com with your mailing address and who you'd like it personalized to.
All of these links are in the show notes, but make sure you get your copy today. Welcome to the podcast. I'm William,
And I'm Kat,
and that makes this Info on the Go.
feeding your curiosity wherever you go.
Kat, have you ever heard of the Dead Sea Scrolls?
I have. I believe I put this on the list.
I think you did too. And, to be honest with you, this is something I have heard about, kind of followed a little bit before we ever started doing the podcast.
For real.
Yeah, actually, and how and why they were in the caves and all this good stuff. And I know we're going to get into it, but yeah, this has been one of those things that's been on my mind for a good 20 years or so, maybe.
Wow. Me
Anyway,
too, but that was only because my mom was interested in it.
and then the Shroud was a big deal, the Dead Sea Scrolls, like there was a whole lot going on. But at any rate, let's just jump into this one. So, in the mid 20th century, in one of the driest and most remote regions on Earth, an accidental discovery would quietly reshape how, we understand ancient scripture, history, and the transmission of sacred text.
The Dead Sea Scrolls are a collection of ancient manuscripts discovered in caves near the Dead Sea, along the cliffs of the Judea Desert. They include some of the oldest known surviving copies of texts from the Hebrew Bible, along with religious writings, community rules, and other documents from a world more than 2,000 years ago.
Hmm. But what makes them so significant isn't just their age, it's what they represent. So, before their discovery, the earliest complete Hebrew biblical manuscripts we had, well, they were over 1,000 years younger. That gap meant scholars had long debated how accurately these texts had been preserved over time. Were they carefully transmitted word for word across centuries? Or had they gradually played the telephone game and changed, from copying, interpretation, and historical pressure? Saw what I did there?
Hmm, hmm.
Ring, ring.
Ring, ring.
Hello.
it sorry, ring ring always brings me back to a funny memory of when me and Casey were teenagers, and that was his phone ringtone, was like a little voice that starts out ring ring. So then in the late 1940s, fragments of these ancient writings began turning up by accident in clay jars hidden inside caves overlooking the Dead Sea. Now, what followed was not a single discovery, but a decade long unfolding mystery. More caves, more fragments, entire communities of ancient writing slowly emerging from the desert.
And as scholars began to piece them together, a deeper question came into focus, one that went far beyond archaeology. Did the Dead Sea Scrolls confirm what we thought we knew about the Bible and its history? Or did the Dead Sea Scrolls kind of complicate it? Depending on who you ask, that answer, well, it has questions of its own.
For some, the scrolls are powerful evidence of textual stability, proof that sacred writings were preserved with remarkable care across centuries. For others, they reveal something more complex, a world where religious texts were still evolving, where multiple versions of scripture existed side by side, and where the idea of a single fixed Bible had not yet fully been formed.
And then there are those who see something else entirely. Questions, not just about preservation or variation, but about access, control, and interpretation itself. And I think Kat and we're going to follow all of those threads as we break it down in this episode of Info on the Go.
Absolutely. We'll look at how the scrolls were discovered, what they actually contain, who may have written them, and why they've sparked decades of debate among scholars, religious thinkers, and public alike. We'll look at how the scrolls were discovered, what they actually contain, and who may have written them, and why they've sparked decades of debate among scholars, religious thinkers, and the public alike. Because the Dead Sea Scrolls aren't just ancient documents, they're a window into a moment when belief, history, and identity were still being written and still being argued over.
Argued over, you say?
I I don't know if that argument ever stopped, but
Coke? I like
Pepsi,
Coke.
Pepsi
No,
for sure.
no, 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 no. Coke.
No, Pepsi.
The Dead Sea Scrolls. Can we agree on that?
Sure,
All right.
for today.
Today, dang. Hey, we agreed on V8. I'm happy with that.
Indeed.
So, the story of the Dead Sea Scrolls doesn't begin in a laboratory or an archive. It begins in one of the harshest landscapes in the region, along the cliffs of the desert caves of Quran, near the southwestern shore of the Dead Sea. And this is a place of extreme silence and extreme conditions. The heat, it's intense because it's a desert. I'm going to leave that in there because I thought it was good.
Yep, right.
Okay. So the terrain is rocky and unstable, and the caves themselves are carved naturally into limestone cliffs overlooking the Jordan Valley. So for centuries, they remain sealed off from the outside world, protected less by design and more by isolation.
And that isolation is exactly what makes what happened next so remarkable. In 1947, a Bedouin shepherd, part of the nomadic Arab community familiar with desert landscape, was reportedly searching for a lost animal when he threw a stone into a cave opening. Instead of the sound of empty rock, he heard something break. And curious, he climbed inside.
Inside the darkness, he found large clay jars. Some were sealed, some were broken open, and inside them were tightly wrapped bundles of ancient looking scrolls. At first, these weren't recognized as anything extraordinary because to the people who first handled them, they were simply old, fragile, manuscripts, something that might have value, but they didn't really understand the significance of what they had.
They sure did.
They definitely did not, because today you could probably get it on eBay billions. Sorry,
For sure.
maybe that's, I
Oh,
think
that might be too hip for me, sorry.
they could put it on eBay and get some Elvis money.
That one was definitely too hip for me.
You know what, man? Let's just rock on.
What followed was a period of confusion and informal trade. Rather than entering an academic or archaeological system, the scrolls began moving through unofficial channels. They were sold to antiquities dealers in Jerusalem, passing through hands that had little idea of their historical importance. It wasn't until scholars began to take notice that the situation changed. One of the key early figures was the Israeli archaeologist and scholar Eliezer Suknik, who recognized that these key fragments were not ordinary artifacts. They were ancient Jewish religious texts, potentially far older than anything previously discovered.
So for that moment, the search expanded rapidly. So between 1947 and 1956, archaeologists and local teams identified 11 separate caves in this particular region, containing additional scroll fragments. Each new discovery added more pieces to a growing and increasingly complex puzzle. Thousands of fragments, many of them incomplete, fragile, and difficult to interpret. But just as important as what was being found was how it was being found. That made all the importance here.
So there was no single coordinated excavation at the beginning. No standardized preservation system, no unified academic control. Instead, the scrolls were being recovered in stages. sometimes by scholars, sometimes by local intermediaries, and sometimes through chance, and even sometimes the antiques market. And that creates an important context for everything that follows.
Yeah, because the Dead Sea Scrolls were not uncovered in a clean, orderly archaeological process. They emerged through a fragmented system of discovery shaped by geography, politics, and timing. This was during a period of regional upheaval in the late, 1940s and early 50s because you had World War II going on from the 40s to 45.
You had some stuff going on for sure.
Yeah, the world was going on during that time.
Yeah. By the time the full scope of the discovery became clear, scholars were no longer just studying ancient texts. They were also trying to reconstruct how those texts had been handled, divided, sold, and interpreted before they ever reached the academic world. And that raises a fundamental issue that will follow the scrolls through every stage of study. Not just what they are, but how their journey from cave to classroom may have shaped what we think we know about them.
To classroom, you say?
Indeed.
They never made it to my classroom.
They didn't make it to mine either, but I think we're missing out on a lot of a different history, so there's that.
So once the fragments were brought together and examined more closely, it became clear that the Dead Sea Scrolls were not a single text, that they were not even a single type of document. What emerged was something far more complex. It was a scattered archive of writings that reflected an entire intellectual and religious world. The materials themselves, well, they only tell part of the story.
Some of the scrolls were written on parchment, carefully prepared animal skin that was commonly used for important documents in the ancient world. Others were written on papyrus, a plant based material often more fragile and used for everyday writing.
So we've covered both parchment and papyrus, right?
Yes,
Multiple
yes.
times, I think.
At this point, yes, yes.
We're just going to add it. We're just going to stack it here, okay?
Because I mean, I think it was in quill writing and it was in like, didn't we do one on the press?
I don't think we've done the printing press yet.
No, but we did talk about the printing press in another episode. We've
I,
done a
I,
lot.
yeah, I don't remember. I know that we've talked about parchment and papyrus quite extensively. You know what? The manuscripts, the Monovich manuscripts,
Yep, yep.
I know parchment was in there.
Papyrus was in one of them too. I mean, for sure.
Anyway, let's just rock on.
In one extraordinary case, a set of instructions was preserved not on a scroll at all, but on copper sheets, a rare and durable medium suggesting it may have been intended to last far longer than ordinary manuscripts.
We've never done one on copper sheets.
No,
That is a future episode, maybe a dash. I don't know.
I guess we'll see.
Yeah. So together, these materials point to something important. This was not a casual writing. These texts were valued, preserved, and deliberately stored. Even more striking is the linguistic diversity. So the scrolls were primarily written in Hebrew, but also Aramaic and Greek. That alone reflects a multilingual world where religious, political, and cultural influence were overlapping. Hebrew appears in both biblical style text and community writings. Aramaic, widely spoken in the region at the time, appears in interpretive and narrative material. Greek, the language of broader Hellenistic influence, shows up in select fragments as well.
This is not a single linguistic tradition. It's a crossroads, and the content is just as varied as the languages. Broadly, the scrolls fall into three major categories. First, there are biblical manuscripts, fragments and copies of texts that later became part of the Hebrew Bible. These include books like Genesis, Deuteronomy, and especially Isaiah, which survives in one of the most complete forms discovered, the Great Isaiah Scroll. Second, there are apocryphal or interpretive writings, texts that resemble biblical literature but were not ultimately included in the canonical Hebrew Bible. These works often expand on familiar stories or offer alternative perspectives on religious history.
And third, there were sectarian or community documents. These are among the most revealing materials in the collection. They include rules for communal life, descriptions of ritual purity, instructions for leadership, and, writings that reflect the beliefs and structure of a distant religious group. Taken together, they show not just what people believed, but how they organized their daily lives around those beliefs.
As for dating, the scrolls span a remarkably wide period. Most are generally placed between the 3rd century BCE and the 1st century CE, a time of significant political and religious change in the region, stretching from the later Hellenistic period to the early Roman era.
So that time frame, it really matters. It places these writings in a world where Jewish identity, language, and religious practice were actively developing and, in many ways, competing. And that leads to the most important realization of all. The Dead Sea Scrolls are not a single book. They are not even a single viewpoint. They are a library that's been fragmented, diverse, and preserved by accident. And that captures a moment when sacred tradition was not yet fixed, but still taking shape. And here, Kat, I say Coke.
Pepsi.
You know, we'll be right back.
Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Hey, listeners, ready to transform your sleep? Cozy Earth is all about lasting luxury and comfort. Their bamboo sheets have been called the world's softest sheets, cooling, moisture wicking, and unbelievably soft. And I can tell you they get better with every wash. And they have a 100-night sleep trial and a 10-year warranty.
But it doesn't stop there. They have bath, sleepwear, loungewears, and even skincare. Free shipping on orders of $50 or more.
Make sure you go to cozyearth.com, use our code INFOGO at checkout to save 21% off. You can find all of this in the show notes.
So, from a religious standpoint, the Dead Sea Scrolls are often seen not as a challenge to faith, but as a powerful reinforcement of it. One of the most widely discussed arguments is the remarkable consistency between the scrolls and later biblical manuscripts. When scholars compared texts found in caves with versions of scripture that had been preserved over the next 1,000 years, they found something striking. In many cases, the core wording remained highly stable, even across vast stretches of time.
An example of this that's cited more often than not is the book of Isaiah. The version found among the scrolls, especially the well preserved Great Isaiah Scroll. It shows a text that is, well, in large sections, extremely close to the form later copied into medieval Hebrew manuscripts. While there are some small variations in spelling, phrasing, and transmission, the details overall and structure, the message really remains recognizably intact.
For many religious scholars and believers, this carries a significant implication. It suggests a careful and disciplined tradition of copying sacred texts over centuries. In other words, the scrolls were viewed as evidence that scribes took great care in preserving scripture with a high degree of fidelity.
From a Jewish perspective, this reinforces the deep historical roots of the tradition. It connects modern religious practice to a much older textual world, showing continuity between ancient communities and later religious identity. So the scrolls became a bridge linking present day scripture to a lived world from over 2,000 years ago.
From a Christian perspective, particularly in discussions of the Old Testament, the scrolls are often seen as supporting the reliability of the biblical foundation. If key texts already existed in forms similar to later versions centuries earlier, then the continuity of those writings can be interpreted as strengthening confidence in the preservation of Scripture over time.
It's really important to note that that this interpretation is not focused on how the scripts, were uniform in the strict sense. It does not claim that every word is identical across all manuscripts. Instead, it really emphasizes something more unique. continuity within variation. So the idea that despite minor differences, the essential message of all these texts really remains stable.
And that's the core of this perspective. Rather than highlighting change, it highlights preservation. Rather than focusing on diversity between manuscripts, it emphasizes the thread that connects them. In this view, the Dead Sea Scrolls do not disrupt the story of Scripture, they extend it further back in time, offering what many see as a rare glimpse into how faithfully these texts may have been transmitted across generations.
Coke,
Pepsi.
we'll be right back. So now that we're back, from an academic standpoint, the Dead Sea Scrolls are less about conforming a fixed version of Scripture and more about revealing a text that was still in motion. So when scholars compared the different manuscripts found in the caves, one of the most important discoveries was there was not a single standardized biblical text at the time that, well, these scrolls were written and copied anyway. Instead, there was multiple versions of the same book circulating at once.
This shows up in the details. Across different fragments, scholars found variations in wording, spelling, sentence structure, and even the arrangement of passages. Some differences are minor, what we might think of as copyist inconsistencies. Others are more meaningful, reflecting alternative textual traditions where the same story or law is presented in slightly different forms. Taken together, these differences point to something significant. The biblical texts we know today may not have existed in a single fixed form during the period represented by the scrolls. Instead, they appear to have been part of a living tradition of transmission and editing, where scribes were copying, preserving, and in some cases, shaping the texts they inherited.
For many scholars, this leads to a broader implication. Rather than static book handed down unchanged, the Hebrew Bible, well, it may have undergone a gradual process of development over centuries, with layers of editing, interpretation, and standardization occurring over time. And this is where the academic approach becomes especially important. Rather than focusing on theological meaning, researchers often emphasize context, authorship, and historical development. Questions like who was copying the text? What community were they serving? How did political and cultural changes influence what was preserved?
Indeed, my same questions, but maybe not in that manner,
Granted,
because it is clear where political things were put in place and things were disseminated in pieces. Because a lot of the time when the original Bible was going around, it was disseminated from one person in in a space
how about this?
because everybody couldn't read.
How about this? Holy Bible shopping list.
Ah, yes.
That's going to be probably a two-parter.
Well, yeah, but this initiates that for sure.
Okay,
Sorry, I
it's all
didn't mean
good.
to go on a tangent there.
Yeah, you did.
In this framework, the scrolls are not just religious artifacts, they are evidence of how texts evolve inside real historical communities. And this leads to one of the central tensions in the Dead Sea Scrolls scholarship. On one side is the idea of stability, the belief that sacred texts were preserved with remarkable consistency over time. On the other is the idea of evolution, and these same texts existed in multiple forms before later traditions standardized them.
So the Dead Sea Scrolls do not resolve this tension. Instead, they make it unavoidable. They show a world where scripture was both preserved and varied, both stable and fluid, depending on which manuscript you are looking at and which moment in time you're examining.
One of the contents of the Dead Sea Scrolls began to take shape. A new and unavoidable question emerged. Who actually wrote them? Because the answer to that question doesn't just explain authorship, it affects interpretation. If the scrolls come from a single community, they reflect one worldview. If they come from multiple sources, they may represent something much broader, a snapshot of an entire religious landscape.
The most widely discussed theory, well, it connects the scrolls to a Jewish sect often associated with the ancient world known as Essenes. The Essenes are described in later historical writings as a group that lived in strict communal organization, emphasizing ritual purity, shared property, and separation from the wider society. Many of the community rules and behavioral guidelines that are found in the scrolls, they seem to align with that kind of lifestyle. Highly structured, discipline focused, and deeply concerned with religious purity and proper interpretation of law.
This is where the archaeological site of Qumran becomes central. Excavations in the area near the caves revealed what appears to be the remains of a settlement that could match descriptions of a communal religious group. Shared dining spaces, ritual bathing installations, and evidence of organized daily life that differs from typical urban or rural domestic structures of the time. Taken together, these points led many scholars to propose that Qumran may have been the home or at least a base of the community that produced or preserved the scrolls.
This is not the only interpretation. An alternate theory suggests that the scrolls did not originate from a single isolated sect at all, but were instead brought together from Jerusalem and surrounding areas. And this view, the caves, well, they may have functioned as a storage site, perhaps used during times of conflict or instability rather than, a permanent mosaic archive. So, but there's also a broader possibility as well. And that's that the scrolls represent multiple groups and traditions rather than a single community. Under this model, the caves would contain, well, a kind of collected religious library from different sources, text copied, preserved, or hidden by various groups across the region.
This interpretation helps explain the diversity found in the manuscripts themselves. If different texts come from different communities, then variation in language, theology, and emphasis becomes less surprising and more expected. But it also complicates the picture, because it means the scrolls are not simply the voice of one sect, but potentially a mosaic of competing or overlapping religious ideas from a turbulent historical period. And that brings us to the core issue underneath all these theories. Whether the scrolls come from Essenes from Jerusalem or from multiple groups, the question of authorship fundamentally shapes how we read them.
So, if they were sectarian, they reflect a narrow but intense worldview. If they were collective, they reflect a broader religious environment still in formation. Either way, the Dead Sea Scrolls are not just asking what ancient Judaism believed, they're asking how many voices were already part of that belief and how those voices shaped what would eventually become tradition.
For all the scholarly excitement surrounding the Dead Sea Scrolls, there is another layer to the story that has nothing to do with ancient history and everything to do with modern controversy. For decades after their discovery, access to many of the scroll's fragments was tightly controlled by a relatively small group of scholars working under institutional authority. These researchers were responsible for sorting, reconstructing, translating, and publishing thousands of fragmented pieces. An enormous task that, by its nature, moved slowly.
But as the years they turned into decades, that slow pace began to attract criticism. One of the main concerns was delay in publication. Large portions of the scrolls remained unpublished or only partially available for years, sometimes even decades after their discovery. For outside researchers, this meant that they could not independently study or verify interpretations of the key text. Closely tied to this was the issue of limited access to materials. In many cases, the physical fragments were not widely available to broader academic community. Instead, they were held by a small additional team, creating a bottleneck in research and fueling frustration among other scholars who wanted to engage with the material directly.
As a result, public attention began to grow, not just within academia, but outside of it. For some observers, especially those unfamiliar with the practical challenges of archaeological reconstruction, the situation raised suspicion. Questions began to circulate about whether certain interpretations were being prioritized over others, or whether information was being intentionally withheld.
This is where conspiracy theories begin to take shape. Some claims they suggested that the scrolls contained suppressed or controversial material that certain institutions didn't want public. Others argued that the slow publication process indicated deliberate control over historical information. However, when examined closely, the scholarly response paints a more grounded picture.
Most historians and archaeologists point to a combination of very practical limitations. The scrolls are extremely fragile, only in tiny fragments requiring painstaking reconstruction. The work is highly specialized, involving multiple languages and paleographic analysis. And for much of the 20th century, the available team of experts were relatively small compared to the scale of the material.
In addition to that, there was also political and institutional complications, including shifting control over excavation sites and academic responsibilities in a region undergoing major geopolitical change. So, in other words, the delays were real, but they were not necessarily evidence of, concealment.
The more measured conclusion among scholars is that this period reflects a genuine tension between academic gatekeeping, limited resources, and public expectation. The system was slow, sometimes frustratingly so, but not necessarily coordinated around secrecy. The balanced takeaway, then, is this. There was real controversy surrounding access to the Dead Sea Scrolls, and that controversy had real consequences for how the material was studied and understood. But not all of the stronger claims made about suppression or hidden content are supported by the historical and academic record. What this chapter ultimately reveals is not just a debate about ancient texts, but a reminder that even the study of the past is shaped by modern systems of access, trust, and interpretation.
And before we get into do the scrolls change religion or not, we're going to take a small break.
Pepsi.
Coke. Dang, you beat me to it. So now that we're back, one of the most common questions.
Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Ready to turn an ordinary day into an unforgettable adventure? Check out QR Hunter. It lets you create custom treasure hunts with reusable QR code tiles. You can personalize clues, puzzles, photo challenges. You can do it all in just a few minutes. It's perfect for birthday parties, family game nights, classrooms, parks, team building events, or if you just want to have family fun. The free QR Hunter app, it works with any smart device. The adventure, it never really ends. You can search for QR Hunter on Amazon, or you can simply click the link in the show notes. But let the adventure start today. Ask about the Dead Sea Scrolls is also one of the most sensitive. Do they contradict the Bible? It's an understandable question, especially given how these texts were discovered and how dramatically they expand what we know about early religious writings. When these fragments of ancient scripture suddenly appear after nearly 2,000 years in the desert, it's natural to wonder whether they disrupt the foundations of later religious tradition or if they confirm them.
What the scrolls actually show is more complicated than a simple yes or no. Within the manuscripts, scholars have identified clear parallels with ideas found in later Jewish and early Christian thought. Themes such as apocalyptic expectation, ritual purity, communal identity, and the struggle between light and darkness appear in ways that echo broader religious developments of that period.
At the same time, one of the most important clarifications is often overlooked. There are no direct references to Jesus in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Despite speculation that sometimes surrounds the topic, the texts predate or overlap with the earliest stages of Christianity's emergence. But they do not explicitly mention Jesus or the early Christian movement.
From a mainstream scholarly perspective, this is where the scrolls are best understood in context rather than in conflict. Rather than contradicting the Bible, the scrolls are generally seen as providing historical and cultural context for how biblical texts were being read, copied, and interpreted in the centuries around their formation. They help illustrate the diversity of religious thought in a period showing that different communities could engage with similar scriptures in different ways.
From a religious perspective, interpretations often move in different directions, but not necessarily opposing directions. For many Jewish and Christian readers, the scrolls are seen as deepening understanding rather than undermining belief. They offer a window into how ancient communities preserved, studied, and lived around sacred text, reinforcing the idea that these traditions have deep historical roots and long-standing continuity.
The Dead Sea Scrolls do not neatly confirm every assumption, nor do they dismantle them. Instead, they introduce the complexity into what might once have seemed like a more straightforward historical narrative. They show variation where uniformity was once assumed, continuity where change was feared, and diversity where simplicity was expected. In the end, they don't force a single conclusion. They expand the range of what the conversation even is. They complicate the story, but they don't necessarily overturn it.
So, as we start to wrap up here, what the scrolls really mean. So, after all the caves, fragments, debates, and interpretations, we have to come back to the central question. What do the Dead Sea Scrolls actually tell us? In many ways, the most important answer is not a single conclusion, but a broader shift in perspective.
The scrolls reveal a dynamic, living religious world, where beliefs were not simply inherited in a fixed form, but actively interpreted, debated, and recorded by different communities over time. What we see in the fragments is not a frozen snapshot of a single tradition, but a layered record of how ideas were being shaped in real historical conditions. In that sense, they show that religious texts were not just preserved, they were part of an ongoing process. They were copied, studied, adapted, and sometimes varied depending on the community and the moment in which they were written.
And this leads us to a bigger takeaway that goes beyond theology or even ancient history. The Dead Sea Scrolls are not only about religion, they are about how humans preserve truth, identity, and meaning across generations. They show what happens when communities try to hold on to what they believe matters most through language, through writing, and through careful transmission in uncertain times. And that is why they continue to matter today.
Because they don't just sit in the past as artifacts to be studied. They reflect something ongoing, the tension between preservation and change, between certainty and interpretation, between what is passed down and what is re-understood. Which brings us back to where we started. What do these ancient texts tell us? They don't give us a single answer. Instead, they give us a window into a time when belief, history, and identity were still being written.
And, before we end here, we're going to kind of quickly go over some of the myths, theories, and misconceptions. Because around almost every major archaeological discovery, a second story develops alongside the academic one, right? And with the Dead Sea Scrolls, that second story has been especially present. It tends to revolve around a few reoccurring ideas, lost books of the Bible, hidden prophecies, or suppressed truths. These claims show up in documentaries, online discussion, and speculative histories. But they don't all carry the same weight when measured against the actual evidence. So it's worth separating what is grounded in the scrolls from what has grown around them. You want to do number one? I'll do number two.
Sounds good.
Okay.
Lost books of the Bible. This is one of the most common claims, and in a limited sense, it contains a small element of truth. The scrolls do include texts that are not part of later standardized Hebrew Bibles. These are often called apocryphal or pseudepigraphical writings, and they show that ancient Jewish religious literature was broader and more diverse than a final biblical canon. However, the misconception is assuming that these are lost books that were once universally accepted and later deliberately removed. What the evidence actually shows is more nuanced. There was no single fixed biblical canon at the time these scrolls were written. Different communities used different texts. The process of canonization happened gradually over centuries. So rather than lost books of the Bible, what we really see is a period before the Bible was fully standardized.
And another popular claim is that the scrolls contain secret or hidden prophecies, sometimes even predictions about modern events. This idea does not hold up under scholarly review. Some scrolls do contain apocalyptic writings, meaning they describe versions of future judgment, cosmic struggle, or divine intervention. These were common themes in Judaism during this period. But they are not coded messages about modern history. They are not predictive in a, unique, traceable way. They reflect the worldview of ancient communities dealing with political and religious uncertainty. So, in other words, they are a theological interpretation of their own time, not hidden forecast of ours.
Suppressed truths. This is perhaps the most dramatic claim that the scrolls contain information deliberately hidden from the public because it would challenge established religious beliefs. This idea grew partly out of real historical frustration. As we discussed earlier, access to some materials was slow, restricted, and tightly controlled for decades. That created a vacuum where speculation could grow. But when the claims are examined closely, the picture becomes more grounded. The delay in publication was largely due to fragmentation, limited expertise, and reconstruction difficulty. Thousands of fragments required painstaking analysis before publication. Once wider access was granted, no suppressed explosive revelation emerged from the material. So while there was real frustration, the leap to intentional concealment is not supported by the evidence.
The final distinction here is that the Dead Sea Scrolls sit in a space where two narratives often overlap. One is the historical record, and this is built from fragments, analysis, and cautious reconstruction. The other is the mythic interpretation, shaped by imagination, suspicion, and modern storytelling. The difference between them is not that one is existing and the other isn't. It's that one is grounded in what the evidence shows, and the other, well, it often extends beyond it. And in the case of the Dead Sea Scrolls, the real story doesn't need to be exaggerated to be remarkable. You put this on the shopping list, didn't you?
I did.
Yeah. This one, it's always intrigued me. I've watched a lot of different documentaries about it. Good call out. I mean, I learned a lot more than I did doing that. So thank you.
You're welcome. In tea time. There's a
So
lot on there. The shopping list is ever growing.
yeah, so the Holy Bible now, I guess if we're going to do that, we're going to have to do the Quran too,
Well, yes, it would be.
and the Eric Veda. What is
There's a
it?
lot of different Bibles.
How about this? So we're going to do one on the Holy Bible. We'll do one on the Quran, and then, any other religious stuff we come across.
I'm sure we will come across a good bit.
Maybe we do the Holy Bible sometime in December.
Sounds good.
Okay. I don't know, there's a lot of research that has to go into that, so we'll see.
That's the oof.
Maybe not this December, but a December. How about that?
Yeah, because that's going to be a big one.
If you would like to support this podcast, tell a word and help get the friend out. Sorry, you can do your thing. I was just messing with you.
If you'd like to support this podcast, tell a friend and help get the word out.
If you would like to support this podcast, you can do so at Patreon or simply take advantage of some of our sponsors. Either way it goes, all of those links are in the show notes.
And as always, we want to thank you for listening.
If you've been with us from day one or just tuned in, Kat and I want to say a big thank you.
Join the Facebook group and Info on the Go,
Over there, you can get to know us.
or ask us a question.
But whatever you do, make sure you hit that follow button wherever you're listening to this podcast.
Send us some fan mail using the link in the show notes, or leave a review.
Leaving that review really does help others find us in an ever-growing world of podcasts. But you can also email us directly at
infoonthegopodcast@gmail.com.
we would really love to hear some show ideas from you. All of this is in the show notes. Till next time.
Stay curious.